think we continue and have a look at stake-bleeding attacks. Peter, the stage is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. So my name is Peter Gaji, and I'll be talking today about proof of stake, more specifically about one particular quite simple generic attack on proof of stake schemes with interesting consequences. And this is joint work with Aggelos Kiayas and Alex Russell. So I will start by first discussing what proof of stake blockchains are and why we should care about them, and why they might be preferable to proof of work blockchains that we all know. Then I will, and just so that we are on the same page, I will summarize some known long-range attacks against proof of stake blockchains, because this is not a new idea. And then I will get to discuss our attack, and I will briefly sketch how it works. I will tell you what we know about its efficiency and applicability, and discuss some potential countermeasures. So let's start somewhere where we all know it, which is obviously Bitcoin. So the problem that Bitcoin solves, or what Bitcoin aims at achieving, is to allow a collection of parties to agree on a dynamic common sequence of transactions on this ledger of transactions that achieves two properties. Persistence, which means that if a transaction is entered into the ledger and is considered stable, it will stay like that, and everyone will see it at the same position, everyone running the protocol. And the second property is liveness, which means that if I want to put a transaction into this ledger, eventually it will get there, right? This is a very informal description of these two desirable properties that we want from such a ledger. And this all should be happening in an environment where the parties come and go, and some of the parties might try to disrupt the whole execution and try to get some profit from that. So this is what Bitcoin achieves. I will, of course, not tell you how it achieves it, because you know it. I will just tell you that it's a good idea to look at Bitcoin as from a maybe slightly different perspective, as a lottery, where we are electing something like, we are running a leader election, where the parties compete for the right to extend the current blockchain that they see. And the certificate of winning in this lottery is simply the solution to the proof of work puzzle. And their probability of succeeding in this, in winning at a particular time moment, is proportional to their computing power as a part of the overall computing power of all the parties that are trying to participate in this lottery. This is, of course, something we all know. Now, the good things that can be said about Bitcoin is that obviously it's an ingenious design that found a simple way to solve a problem that was previously considered difficult or even impossible. And this is thanks to a new assumption, which is the honest majority of computational power. This was one of the novelties that Bitcoin brought. And this is already, of course, formally established by cryptographers in a line of work that I cite in the slides. However, Bitcoin is not the end of the story, at least I think so. And the main criticism that you can often hear about Bitcoin, and I find it relevant, is that as it relies on this ongoing computational race that I already described to you, this leads to an ever-increasing cycle of spending more and more power for mining and increasing the power consumption. The current estimates, which are very so it's hard to take them precisely, but probably the consumption of Bitcoin is somewhere on the order of single units of gigawatts. And even more worryingly, this number almost tripled over the last 6 months, and didn't decrease so much after the price decreased. So, okay, so this might seem a little worrying. And also, it's good to realize that the cost of a potential attack on the Bitcoin network is proportional, at least, I mean, very roughly, to the energy spent during the period of the attack. So if we want to keep Bitcoin secure, we need to consistently invest this energy. And this might seem worrying to some. So, I mean, early on, this was recognized as a problem, and a potential challenge that protocol designers were looking into was how to replace the proof of work lottery by a lottery that would be based on a different resource. First, various other physical resources were considered with different properties. So, for example, using disk space instead of computation. This could lead on to proof of space-based cryptocurrencies, or maybe making the resource used in a useful way beyond just maintaining the networks, either the computation or the storage, to make it useful also in that way. And there were proposals in that direction. But a completely different avenue is to replace this real resource with a virtual resource, namely the coin itself. And this is the idea of proof of stake. So this is as much as we need to know about proof of stake for now. So basically, proof of stake is basing this lottery on the stake that is already recorded on the blockchain, because we assume that the blockchain tracks ownership of some coins that are distributed among the parties executing the protocol. And so the idea is that the participants are elected to create the next block with a probability that is proportional to the stake that they own in the system. This completely alleviates the need for wasting any physical resources and sounds like an awesome solution. But it turns out that this is not so easy to implement securely. I will not have the time to go into details, but there were many early proposals that turned out to be insecure, and I will describe some of the long-range attacks which kind of fit our team later in the talk. There were, as I said, there are several proposals in the wild that propose proof of stake type of solution, and there are also some proposals coming from academia that aim at provable security or proving the security of the protocol under particular assumptions. These lists are not exhaustive. I would just like to now split these academia-based proposals into two broad clusters, where the first one aims for an eventual or Nakamoto-style consensus, where blockchain is being built and some kind of a longest chain rule is being applied to figure out which blockchain is the actual state of the ledger. And a different approach that is most notably taken by Algorand, which I call here a blockwise Byzantine agreement, which means that a full Byzantine agreement protocol is run for each of the blocks, and only after the block is stabilized, the protocol moves to another block. I mentioned this second group here only for comparison, but the attack that I will be describing in broader terms considers the first cluster of protocols. So we will be focusing on eventual consensus protocols. So let me tell you what I mean by that. I will not go into the specifics of any of the protocols that I described to you, because there is no time for that. So I will just describe some characteristic properties that are important for the attack that I will consider, and several of the protocols do have these properties. So one of the properties is stake proportional growth. This is like at the heart of a proof of stake design, and this property basically means that if you consider the time split into some consecutive intervals, then the probability that the party is eligible to create a block and extend the blockchain in a particular interval is proportional to its stake. So this is the first property. The second property is that some kind of longest chain rule is applied on the chains to figure out which of the chains is the actual state of the ledger. Possibly the chains are first filtered by some validity rule, but then the actual state is chosen out of those that remained as valid by a longest chain rule. And finally, a crucial assumption in all these eventual consensus protocols is the assumption of an honest stake majority, which means that more than 50% of the stake is assumed to be controlled by parties that follow the protocol. And this is akin to the majority of hashing power assumption in Bitcoin, right? There is a very clear one-to-one connection between these assumptions. So one thing that clearly differentiates the proof of stake setting from the proof of work setting is the costless simulation property. This is a property that of proof of stake systems that blocks are usually very cheap to create. So you typically just have to do one signature, because typically every participant in such a protocol is represented by a public key, and if this participant somehow won the lottery and is allowed to create a block, he certifies that this block is indeed created by him, but by just signing this block with the respective secret key. So blocks are really cheap to create, and this has several implications. The first one is that if the winner of the lottery is adversarial, he can simply create many different blocks and spread them selectively in an attempt to confuse all the other participants and try to break down the whole protocol in one way or another. And the second implication is that even long blockchains can be simulated almost instantly. So you can try to create a fake history of a proof-of-stake protocol very quickly, because every block in this history can simply requires you, if you somehow manage to pretend that you are eligible to create these blocks, then it's just one signature, right? So you can generate it very quickly, as opposed to a proof-of-work setting where generating an alternative history for Bitcoin would cost you a lot of work, right? So this is a property we will consider in the recognized early on, and the first long-range attack that was proposed, or that was publicly considered, was proposed by Vitalik Buterin in 2014 in a blog post. And this is a proposal against an, let's say, naive proof-of-stake system that would simply just apply the longest chain rule without any further consideration. And the attack works roughly like this. So basically what you can do is, if you are an adversary, you can try to create an alternative attack chain that will contain only blocks created by you. And now, since you, by assumption, you have a minority of stake, these blocks will be much less frequent, right? So the alternative attack chain will be less dense, because it will be less common that you win the lottery than the honest parties participating in the blue public chain. But simply you create this blockchain far into the future, and this allows you to create more blocks than the public chain has, and therefore everyone following the longest chain rule should then adopt your alternative blockchain. And this is of course a problem, because now you have just rolled back all the transactions in the final part of the blue blockchain, and this contradicts persistence as I described it at the beginning. Now, of course, already in that same blog post, Vitalik observes that there is a very simple countermeasure against this. You just have to use some form of timestamping, and you have to consider invalid any block that comes from the future. So this attack would no longer be possible. But it makes sense to consider it just as an illustration of a very simple long-range attack. And so this is the idea of a long-range attack against the proof-of-stake blockchain protocols, that you try to create a possibly very far into the past variant of the blockchain, and then convince even the honest participants that this is the true blockchain, this is the true history. Especially this is a problem with newly joining parties, which don't know that, well, for the years I have believed the blue blockchain, and now I should start believing the orange one. That might seem suspicious to someone who is participating from the beginning, but it might seem completely legit to someone who just joined the system. So this is the idea of long-range attacks. And another, I would say much more serious long-range attack was considered later. I will call it here, or actually it was called before, posterior corruption attack. And the idea is as follows. So if you have such a public blockchain, the blue one, that has been created by the execution of the protocol over a long time, what you can do is try to corrupt a small fraction of keys in the final block at the time T1. Let's say that's present. But choose the keys in such a way. Maybe it's better now. So you can try to choose the keys in such a way that long ago in the past, in the time T0, these keys actually control the significant majority of the stake. And if that's the case, then actually you can use these keys to create an alternative history, because at that point T0 you actually control a majority of the stake, right? And so the blockchain is under your control, and this allows you to create an alternative history and break things. So this is the posterior corruption attack. There are also some countermeasures obviously implemented against this type of an attack, as it's a well-known attack. The first countermeasure considered and widely implemented in proof-of-stake blockchains is a frequent checkpointing. So this is the idea that we could take some of the blocks and basically carve them into stone. So assume a recent snapshot of the blockchain that can be obtained in a trusted way from the system, and no parties will be able to roll back beyond, I mean, further to the past than such a checkpoint is. But you see the word trusted in the slide, so this is inevitably a trust assumption, and so one would probably want to go without that. But let's just illustrate that this prevents any long-range attacks, because by definition a long-range attack would go far into the past, and this would violate. So this would mean rolling back further to the past than the last checkpoint. And the two variants of this that appear are either regular checkpoint, as you can see in the picture, or some protocols adopt something that is called moving checkpoint, which means that the party that is running the protocol, one of the parties, is not willing to go back than a particular number K of blocks. And this basically means that all the blocks before are considered checkpoints. So this is a limitation to the longest chain rule. And a second countermeasure that was considered for these posterior corruption attacks is the use of key-evolving cryptography. So in particular, key-evolving signature schemes are signature schemes where the public key is fixed, but the secret key can be updated, and it's actually mandatory for the parties participating in the protocol to update the secret key regularly. And the newer secret key cannot be used to produce signatures belonging to the older secret keys. So you are not able, even if you corrupt a party that and get its secret key, you are not able to create signatures on behalf of that party that would appear to be from the past. And this seems to be exactly what you need in such a setting, because in the posterior corruption attack, if I corrupt this little fraction of keys in time t1, even if these players controlled a lot of stake in time t0, thanks to the key evolving property, I'm no longer capable of executing the attack because I cannot create blocks with past signatures. So these are well-known countermeasures, and it's interesting to notice that these countermeasures can be broadly partitioned into two groups. So the first one, we call it model restricting. These are countermeasures like assuming checkpoints that in one way or another add an additional assumption into our security model or restrict the model in a particular way. So either we assume a secure provider of these checkpoints, and on the other side we have these algorithmic countermeasures that simply when we apply them, we simply modify the protocol in some way, and obviously this second class of countermeasures is much more desirable because you don't need to make additional assumptions, you just change your protocol. You, for example, use timestamps, or you use key-evolving cryptography, or there are other examples that I will not go into. And of course, these countermeasures are used in one way or another by the existing protocols. But what I want to say, or what motivated this work, is the question whether this is the whole story. So key-evolving cryptography in particular seems like a very strong tool against long-range attacks. And so the question is, are there other long-range attacks that we should be aware of when designing proof-of-stake protocols? And does key-evolving cryptography prevent all forms of long-range attacks because it doesn't allow us to tamper with what happened in the past? And in this paper, by showing one simple attack, we answer both these questions. So we give a new long-range attack that is not prevented by key-evolving crypto, and therefore needs to be considered or taken into account when one is trying to design proof-of-stake protocols, and doesn't want to revert to making the checkpointing assumption, which as I mentioned is quite undesirable. So the stake bleeding attack, the content of our work, is a quite generic long-range attack against eventual consensus proof-of-stake blockchains. So against the blockchains that I described to you. It doesn't rely on posterior corruption of keys, so it's not prevented by key-evolving crypto. But what it does require is, among other things, the usual transaction fees mechanisms, as you all know it from Bitcoin and basically all the other cryptocurrencies. So when I pose a transaction, I also pay some fee to the miner or to whoever creates the block that this transaction is included in. And it requires that chains that have a temporarily low density of blocks are acceptable. We will get to why this is needed later. So for now, let me just mention that. So I will now try to describe the attack. I will describe it now as an online attack happening by an adversary that is present. But you will see from the description that this can actually, to some extent, be done exposed or slightly modified to be done exposed and run as a long-range attack over a long period of past history of the blockchain. So how the attack looks. So let's imagine there is a public blockchain that looks like this. And at some point, the adversary decides that he wants to create an alternative attack chain. So what he will be doing is that so of course, so he will keep this attack chain secret. That's the first part. So he will not broadcast anything about it. But so obviously, then when an honest player or honest party will be allowed to create a block, will win this lottery that decides who is supposed to create a block, it will extend the public chain because it doesn't know about any other chain, and it applies the longest chain rule, right? But when the adversary gets the right to extend a blockchain, he will not extend the public one, so he will pretend he was offline or anything. This is typically accepted by the protocols, and instead he will only create a block in the attack chain and still keep the attack chain secret. And the process will proceed like this. But one important thing that the attacker will be doing is that he will include all valid transactions that he has observed in the public chain also into the attack chain. So in the public chain, you have some normal flow of transactions that are happening. And the attacker is basically collecting these transactions and putting them into the blocks that he is creating privately for himself. And of course, cashing out all the fees for these transactions. And so while in the public chain, the stake ratio of the adversary is remaining constant. Imagine an attacker that has like 10 or 20% of stake, which satisfies our assumption that he doesn't control the majority of the stake. In the attack chain, which is completely virtual in the head of the attacker, the adversarial stake ratio is increasing because the attacker is cashing out all the fees from the transactions, but the honest parties are not getting any fees because they are not creating any blocks. And if we zoom out a bit, what will happen eventually is that, well, the growth rate of the public chain will be constant because it will be only the honest parties creating blocks, and we know that there's this property of stake proportional growth. But the growth rate of the attack chain will be increasing because the adversary will have more and more stake. And eventually, we will hit a point where there will be an equal growth rate between these two. From that point on, the attack chain will be growing even faster than the public chain. And finally, we arrive at the point where there will be equal chain length between the public chain and the attack chain. And now, any single block that is added to the attack chain basically makes the attack succeed because the adversary is in possession of this attack chain that is actually longer than the public chain. So whenever he decides to publish it, all the parties following the protocol should switch to this chain because it's just longer, right? So the longest chain rule forces them to do that. And this obviously hurts persistence of the protocol because all the history throughout the attack has been reverted or modified. Okay, so this is just a description of the attack from the paper. Now one can think about the attack, as we describe it here, eventually just succeeds. But the question is what eventually means. So if you do just some back of the envelope calculations, you will find out that the expected time until this moment happens when the attack chain is longer than the public chain is upper bounded by 3 minus x alpha over f, where alpha is the initial adversarial relative stake. So imagine an adversary with I don't know, 20% stake, so this would be 0.2. And F is the amount of fees per time slot in which the lottery is run. These expectations are a good guidance for how long it will take. So it makes sense to think about how long this actually takes. So we looked at the Bitcoin statistics at the Bitcoin network for some statistics on fees. Bear in mind that I'm not claiming that this attack can be applied on Bitcoin. It's just for the statistics on the amount of fees. Of course, Bitcoin doesn't use proof of stake at all. We consider, I mean, to be on the safe side, if we want to argue that this attack is not a problem, we consider a 20-fold increase due to future scaling. This was actually one of the proposals that was discussed in the scaling debate, but of course didn't happen. And then you can see that it takes several years, depending on what your relative stake is at the beginning of the attack. So this is clearly not a practical attack that you would want to start tomorrow. But I would claim that this is something that also in practice needs to be considered when you are designing a proof of stake system that you want to make work without checkpointing. So if you agree with me that checkpointing is undesirable for a proof of stake system, and you want to have an eventual consensus longest chain rule proof of stake system, you need to take this attack into account. And even more important, this is if you want to have a provably secure proof of stake system, because typically the models in which proof of stake systems are analyzed, they require that the protocol works under an arbitrary transactions being inserted into the ledger. Basically, the ledger security should be independent of what you write into it, right? You just have some security assumption, in particular in terms of, in the case of proof of stake, this is that the majority of stake is not controlled by the adversary. But otherwise, you let it to be controlled by the adversary. Transactions are being input into this ledger. And interestingly, this highlights the point that in proof of stake systems, as opposed to proof of work systems, there is this intimate connection between the content of the transactions which carry the money transfers and the security of the consensus mechanism of the ledger, because that one is based on stake, right? And so subtleties like this might arise if one is not careful enough. So now let me just very quickly mention some options how to mitigate this attack. Obviously, we can just try to violate at least one of the requirements that are needed for the attack. So it needs that the protocol doesn't use frequent checkpoints and that it does have noticeable transaction fees. So we might introduce checkpoints into our protocol, but as I said, this might be undesirable. I think it is undesirable because decentralized checkpoints. So centralized checkpoint assumption is not something you would want in a decentralized system. And removing transaction fees is, of course, also an option, but typically not a desirable one. So both of these are model restricting and not so desirable. And the other two requirements of the attack that you can try to mitigate is you can try to prevent the possibility of moving the transactions from the public chain to the attack chain. So you can try to make transactions context sensitive. Or you can try to do some statistics on the density of the chains and prevent the validity of low growth chains. This is a requirement of the attack, as I told you, because the attack chain at the beginning is quite sparse because the attacker only has a small stake, and since the growth of the chain is proportional to his stake, because he's the only one extending this chain, the chain has a considerably low growth. And if you consider such chains invalid, this is also an algorithmic prevention of the attack. So, okay, this basically says what I already told you. So the first mitigation would be to make the transactions context sensitive, for example, by including a hash of some recent block into the transaction, and this prevents them from being moved from the public chain to the attack chain. And this seems to be the simplest mitigation of this particular attack. The second one, doing some statistics on the sparseness of the chain before accepting it, This would also prevent the attack, but it seems more cumbersome to define these statistics, and so we didn't pursue it in this particular work. But let me tell you that during this and further research that we were doing in this area, we proposed a more involved sparseness statistics measure used to decide or to filter blockchains as an addition to the longest chain rule that gives us the first proof-of-stake protocol that has a secure bootstrapping from Genesis property. This is the property that when you join the execution of the protocol much later, so for example, I would like to join Bitcoin now and I don't have the whole blockchain. The only thing I have is a trusted copy of the Genesis block. The question is, can I or can I not securely figure out if people send me various copies or potential candidates for the actual blockchain? Can I figure out which one is the true one? So this is a thing that with Bitcoin, this is trivial. You can do it, of course, but this is due to its proof-of-work nature. And in a proof-of-stake protocol, this is a much more challenging task, and it's intimately connected to the longest chain, to the long-range attacks, because basically trying to fool such a joining party is basically like trying to execute a long-range attack. So these two questions are very tightly connected, and we propose this variant of the Ouroboros proof-of-stake protocol called Ouroboros Genesis that does have secure bootstrapping from Genesis via such sparseness statistics. And this also implies that the protocol is provably secure against all long-range attacks, including stake bleeding, of course, without the need of checkpointing. So you can find it on ePrint. And let me just summarize by giving you some overview of the landscape of these long-range attacks. So I told you about this simple long-range attack proposed by Lucerne, and that requires the pure application of longest chain rule and can be prevented by timestamps. Then we have the posterior corruption attack, which requires no checkpoints and corruptible old keys, and again can be prevented either by the model restricting introduction of checkpoints or simply by key evolving crypto. And in this paper we introduced the stake bleeding attack, which cannot be prevented by key evolving crypto, but can be prevented by either context-sensitive transactions or particular enforcement of fixed chain density, high chain density. And with this, I would end my talk, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. Do we have questions? We have time for one question.
If there's a transaction limit to the blocks, to the block size, then you might not be able to include all the transactions in your fake chain because you have larger gaps between them, right? And that again means that sooner or later you will have invalid transactions because input-output doesn't match.
Yes.
Doesn't that significantly decrease the probability of that attack?
So that is a fair point, and that's why I said that you include all valid transactions, because you want to keep the attack chain valid so that eventually you can present it. So yes, this is a valid concern. It would be a very crucial concern if I was proposing to actually run the attack. But I'm more suggesting this attack as something that you need to have in mind when you are considering provable security of such. So basically as a counterexample, right? So this is not something you would want to run tomorrow. So and in that environment where the transactions are under control of the adversary, this is not a problem. But you are right. So the attack would have to account for that. It would only include valid transactions, and this might lead to a decrease of which transactions you might be able to include. So yeah, that's a good point.
One more question, yeah?
So for the checkpoint solution, which is undesirable because you need a trusted third party, which you don't want in a blockchain. couldn't such a trusted third party also be another blockchain that is based on proof of work and thereby securing the other one?
Well, you can try to figure out a decentralized solution to the checkpointing problem, and this could be one proposal, right? I'm not saying that such a solution doesn't exist, but this introduces further requirement that you need to think about for the attack surface. And in particular, in your case, if we were relying on checkpointing and the checkpoints would be put in a proof of work blockchain, then suddenly to the majority of honest stake assumption, we would also have to take majority of honest computational power assumption, right? Because we need that the proof of work blockchain cannot be rolled back. So suddenly we would have two assumptions. So probably not so good, because we were trying to avoid this proof of work assumption.
Yeah, thank you very much.